President Donald Trump delivered his State of the Union address Tuesday night. He talked about how his immigration crackdown helped build a more secure border, claiming that millions of unvetted immigrants have entered the country illegally. He also called for a full restoration of funding for the Department of Homeland Security. He blamed Democrats for the DHS's shutdown as lawmakers proposed the need to overhaul ICE enforcement policies. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we talk about the state of immigration and immigration enforcement here in Connecticut and across the nation. We'll touch on ICE's presence here in the state and immigration reform. That's later on in the hour. Joining us now to break down what we heard this week in the State of the Union is Lisa Hagen. She's the federal policy reporter with Connecticut Public and Connecticut Mirror. Lisa, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And so during the State of the Union address, President Trump spoke extensively on immigration. Here's a quick clip from what we heard Tuesday night.
The only thing standing between Americans and a wide open border right now is President Donald J. Trump and our great Republican patriots in Congress. Thank you. Thank you. As we speak, Democrats in this chamber have cut off all funding for the Department of Homeland Security. It's all cut off. Now they have closed the agency responsible for protecting Americans from terrorists and murderers. Tonight I'm demanding the full and immediate restoration of all funding for the border security, homeland security of the United States.
So, Lisa, this was followed by several minutes of applause and followed with President Trump directly telling Democrats in the chamber that they should be ashamed. So two things here. Can you help us, or can you tell us what happened with DHS and respond to what we heard from President Trump about DHS?
Yeah, so his first State of the Union of his second term was happening on the backdrop of a partial government shutdown. That's specifically of the Department of Homeland Security, and it's the third, kind of shutdown we've seen in the last 5 months. And so it was not surprising to hear him talk about this and address it, and then obviously tie it to immigration, because that's kind of why Congress has seen a shutdown of DHS specifically. And so it's specifically tied around ICE funding and Democrats seeking reforms to that agency. So, it was a wide-ranging State of the Union. It was not surprising to hear him really focus on immigration. And I think what we heard was him really doubling down on that agenda and on his immigration crackdown, and really try to challenge Democrats on that. And so, we're kind of ending or getting close to the end of the second week of the DHS shutdown. And, we're not really seeing much movement, but it was, a frequent topic of State of the Union 2 nights ago.
And several Connecticut lawmakers, including U.S. Senator Chris Murphy, Representative Larson, and Representative Jim Himes, did not attend the State of the Union. Instead, they gathered at the People's State of the Union on the National Mall. What's the People's State of the Union?
It was basically the counter-programming rally against the State of the Union. And so, there's always, inklings of some Democrats or Republicans, vice versa, depending on who's in the administration, of boycotting the State of the Union. That's happened before, but boycotting on this level, I think it was a much larger scale. And so, in the double digits of how many Democrats did not attend the address on Tuesday night. And so I think there was about almost 36 Democrats that specifically attended this People's State of the Union. It was organized by these progressive groups, and it was on the National Mall. And so we could see the Capitol building in the background while they were speaking. Democrats were doing some other different rallies or speeches, or just something else that was different than the State of the Union. But 3 of the Connecticut delegation members were there, and kind of Murphy kicked it off for the night.
Well, so a lot of things happening here on this front. And earlier this month, Representative Rosa DeLauro, Joe Courtney, and Jim Himes all voted in favor of a package to end a partial government shutdown, as you mentioned just now. And DeLauro says that provides an opportunity to call for reforms to ICE. And here's what she said on The Wheelhouse.
We have the opportunity to overhaul, to reform an agency, and we can begin to do that in the short term. Imagine if we got them to say yes to a judicial warrant. Imagine, would that not be a reform? Would that not be, if we said you can't go? Do we protect sensitive locations? These are real reforms.
So, Lisa, there's been a lot of conversation recently about reforms. And so, can you talk about how the Connecticut delegation has come down on funding the government amid calls for immigration reform?
Yeah, it's been a tricky one for Democrats because they're all aligned, I think, on the ideological perspective of this. They want to see reforms to ICE. And so they're trying to use government funding as a vehicle to enact that change because they're in the minority in both chambers of Congress. But at the same time, to pass government funding, you do need Democratic votes, at least in the Senate. And so this is why we're seeing a lot of challenges for government funding, just not even this time, but just in the last, half a year. And so Democrats have made a number of demands. And so I guess when you hear Congressman DeLauro talk about this, is that some of the members in the delegation, they voted to continue funding for DHS, but also it was tied to 6 other government agencies. And so they wanted to keep that open, and they thought that would be a bit of leverage to get them to be able to negotiate these ICE reforms. The others that didn't vote for it, they also want ICE reforms. They just thought, we're not going to fund DHS, period, full stop. So it's kind of there was a difference in process, I guess you could say, but they're all under the same umbrella of wanting to enact ICE reforms. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, is that Senate Democrats mostly and the White House are negotiating. The negotiations feel largely stalled. Again, we are almost ending the second week of a DHS shutdown. We're about to enter a third. I haven't seen real movement, but that's exactly what DeLauro was talking about, was that these different reforms, whether it's on judicial warrant, banning masks of federal agents, wearing body cameras, I mean, a whole host of them. So that's what's really at the center of this fight.
And what has ICE's presence in Connecticut look like so far?
I think it looks quite differently than, I would say, maybe other places in the country that are getting a lot of attention. Obviously, I mean, there's presence of ICE everywhere, right? And so it's that we've seen surges of ICE agents or federal agents. It could also be Border Patrol in places like Minnesota, which is again drawing down that surge. Other states and other cities that we've seen them ramp it up, and so it's everywhere, and it exists in Connecticut as well. But I think it's important to distinguish the difference between that. There was always going to be an ICE presence in all of these different states and cities. It's just a difference of whether it's a surge and if it's on the same level as Minneapolis. And something I wanted to just mention was that I spoke to Governor Ned Lamont about this because he was in DC last week, and what Trump had told him when he asked a question in a private White House meeting was that apparently Trump had said that any city that doesn't ask for a surge in ICE agents will not receive it. And so I don't see Governor Lamont asking for one. And so at least what was told from the president to Governor Lamont, we shouldn't expect an ICE surge unless asking for it.
Well, and building on what you just mentioned, and we do have a President Trump quote saying we're not going to send ICE into any cities that don't ask for it, in relation to what you just shared of Governor Lamont asking the question. And so just building on that, and because ICE's presence in the state is so different, as you mentioned, compared to other states, how have other local lawmakers responded to this, whether the presence or just the progress of potentially doing reform?
Yeah, I can obviously speak to this a little bit better about what they're pushing at the federal level, but I think it complements what they're trying to do in the states. And frankly, given how I just talked about the fact that it's a very divided government, it's hard to get things through Congress. We might see a lot of these pushes and these efforts that are happening in tandem. Probably the state level might be a better venue to push that. And so we've seen both in the state legislature, but also bills that the Connecticut congressional delegation is pushing, and also Democrats as a whole are pushing in Congress, is banning ICE agents, or I should say federal agents, at polling places. And that's part of a policy of making sure that federal agents aren't in sensitive locations. So it's not just polling places, but it's in schools, it's in places of worship, it's in sensitive locations. And that's a policy that has been rescinded, and I think has been a part of the equation in terms of trying to seek reforms, whether at the federal or the state level. And so again, I think there's complementary efforts, but given the landscape of Congress, it's going to be hard. And the fact that, I was just saying negotiations feel rather stalled in Congress, we might be seeing these pushes come up as the state legislature, the General Assembly is having their session currently.
And so much going on here, and I want to take it a bit more regionally at this moment because earlier this week, New Hampshire also canceled plans to open an ICE detention facility in Merrimack. So, do you think we could possibly see similar plans crop up here in Connecticut?
It's possible. I'm based down in Washington D.C. in the Maryland area, and there's a current fight happening not too far from where I live in terms of opening up detention facilities, and so it's totally possible. I don't know specifically what plans they have, but I think what we're seeing across the country in various different states. It's totally possible that happens in Connecticut, and we're in a state where it's a completely Democratic delegation at the federal level. Obviously, there's big majorities of Democrats at the state level in the General Assembly. And so, I'll be interested to see what they push. And obviously, there's a lot more weight to be throwing around for Democrats in the state of Connecticut than at the federal level in Washington, D.C.
Well, and as you just shared, I think just writing on that too, you'll be following this very closely, of course. What are you expecting next?
I think now that we're kind of past State of the Union, now that Congress is back, they were off for about a week around the holiday. I think the focus is really going to turn to trying to reopen DHS. And so I think it gets a little bit lost in it sometimes because we're so focused on ICE and immigration enforcement, but that's not obviously the only thing that DHS does. It's also FEMA. It's the Coast Guard, it's TSA. And so I think we're starting to see that. There's this little bit of push and pull. Anytime we're in a shutdown, there's always the different pressure points that happen, whether that's, local outcry and people responding to a shutdown. But I think what we've seen is the administration try to, handcuff Congress on this a little bit and push them to do so. So there was a little bit of a fight over closing TSA pre-check lines, those priority lines going through the airport. That was rolled back, but that's still kind of hanging out in the open. And so I think we're going to see a little bit more of those pressure points crop up. But again, the immigration enforcement is at the crux of this DHS fight. And so I expect, maybe as we head into the third week of the shutdown next week, people are going to start to get a bit antsy. And I imagine negotiations in whatever that might look like might ramp up a little bit more.
And we'll be talking more about the DHS's role in our state later on in the hour. You've been listening to Lisa Hagen, who is our federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and Connecticut Mirror. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, ICE agents have been spotted throughout Connecticut. We hear how immigrant communities are responding. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Several Connecticut lawmakers have opposed funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has carried out raids in major cities across the nation, resulting in mass arrests, deportations, and the high-profile killings of Minneapolis residents Renee and Alex Pretti are two among many deaths. Some are calling to abolish the agency completely, while others are urging deeper immigration policy reform. Today, we talk about what that reform could look like. And we'll also hear how immigrant communities in Connecticut are responding. Joining us now is Maureen Abel. She's a staff attorney at New Haven Legal Assistance Association and also a visiting clinical professor at Yale Law School. Thank you so much, Maureen, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Sarah Pierce, who is the Director of Social Policy at Third Way, a national think tank and advocacy organization. And Sarah joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time as well, Sarah.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And for our listeners, find us online at Where We Live and let us know, what does meaningful immigration reform look like to you? give us a call, 888-720-9677. So before we jump into the conversation about immigration reform, Sarah, would love to get your thoughts on what we heard at the State of the Union this week.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, the State of the Union was pretty tone deaf considering the concerns Americans have brought up regarding how this administration is approaching interior and immigration enforcement. We also heard this administration's strategy, when it comes to that fight over DHS funding and the fight over how this administration is doing interior and immigration enforcement. They're really attacking sanctuary jurisdictions, meaning jurisdictions where they limit the amount that local police participate in immigration enforcement. They're really blaming sanctuary jurisdictions for the chaos that the administration has brought onto American streets. And then we also saw the same repeated political strategy that has been winning Donald Trump political points on this issue for more than a decade, which is distinguishing between what Republicans advocate for on immigration, which is advocating that immigration works for Americans, and framing Democrats as being for or are fighting for the rights of unauthorized immigrants over Americans. And he forced the audience to stand up if they agreed with the statement that the first duty of the American government is to protect American citizens and not illegal aliens. And he really chided Democrats for not standing up when he put out that challenge. And I think that is going to be a repeated theme from this administration going into the elections this year.
Well, and of course, today we're more focused on DHS's role in immigration. And as we heard from Lisa Hagan, our federal policy reporter earlier, there's so much more that DHS does besides immigration. So can we talk about, Sarah, when and how did this agency first get started?
Sure. So it was in the aftermath of 9/11. There was a lot of realization that our security agencies within the government weren't communicating like how they should. And also that the fact that the terrorists in 9/11 came in through the immigration system really spurred a reframing for how the government thinks about immigration and pushed the government to think about it more through a security lens. So where all of our immigration system previously existed under the Department of Justice, they moved it all into this new department, the Department of Homeland Security, and they also separated immigration enforcement from immigration adjudications, which is why we have CBP and ICE, which enforce our immigration laws. And then separately, we have an organization called USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is supposed to just focus on benefits adjudication.
And so I think throughout our own history, there's been a lot of work on trying to make the immigration system a bit better to fit the country and for people to apply, so to speak. But, why is it so difficult to enter the country legally? Has it always been this way? What have been some changes over the years?
So the biggest thing that has caused difficulty is really the failure of Congress to do anything on legalization or addressing legal pathways. We haven't had any reforms on those fronts in more than 30 years. We have had developments on security, just like I was talking about with the Department of Homeland Security, lots of legislation related to immigration enforcement and the border, but we haven't updated those pathways for people to come into the country. So we had set these levels in stone really before the internet was a thing. So the demands for our country and what we need are far different than what they were back then. And previously, we also legalized unauthorized immigrants at regular intervals, recognizing that our system was imperfect, that some of the people here who were not authorized to be here were actually contributing to the community. But we've, again, failed to do that in decades. And so this has contributed to this very broken and outdated and expiring system.
Well, and so many moving parts, of course, when it comes to immigration reform. And there have been many calls to abolish ICE, especially recently. But you have written extensively about not abolishing it, rather reform it. So can you give us an idea of what that looks like?
Sure. So just, to start on why I don't think we should abolish ICE, we need enforcement of our immigration laws right? Like just for the integrity of the immigration system, those laws do need to be enforced. And I also don't think that the public is actually on board with abolishing ICE. When you see polling of the phrase abolish ICE, there's actually broad confusion about what that phrase even means. So even those folks who are advocating for the abolishment of ICE don't necessarily agree about what that means and what that looks like. There is a lot we can do, however, to reform ICE to make this a agency that actually abides by the same professional standards that we require of local law enforcement, not wearing masks, identifying themselves, acting professionally, and putting public safety at the center of what they do. And we have seen none of that from ICE under this administration.
Well, and then actually just with what you just shared, with the amount of violence that we are seeing from ICE, how do you respond to those that don't see a future where the organization can continue to exist?
I mean, I would say that we need politically and practically for that organization to exist. And that's why I do advocate for an overhaul of the agency. We need to look at the individuals working at this agency. There are some good men and women that work there. Help them improve the agency from the inside out. And I think we're going to have some very serious conversations moving forward about who stays in the agency, especially since we've had a huge hiring spree under the Trump administration. They've brought on 12,000 officers, and there's a lot of questions about what their motivations were for joining the agency, whether they were thoroughly vetted, and certainly how they were trained.
And so just another quick reminder for our listeners that you can give us a call and let us know, what does meaningful immigration reform look like to you? 888-720-9677. And joining us now on the phone is Maggie Mitchell-Salem from the Integrated Refugees and Immigration Services in New Haven. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been following the conversation. Anything that jumped out to you that you would like to respond to?
You know, we see the implications every day of this discussion on the people that we serve, refugees, asylum seekers, those who are undocumented, who are trying to adjust status. And I guess, you know, where I wanted to take this is to the question of how hard is it to enter the country legally, right? That seems to be one of the big questions. Well, why don't people just wait in line? Why don't they wait their turn? And I think this whole conversation is pointing out different reasons why that has been increasingly difficult, the lack of immigration reform for the past 30 years, with the exception of the changes to the agencies and the security posture after 9/11. But there's been no real change. And waiting in line as the number of crises around the world grow, as we see exponential growth in the number of people who are seeking safety and security, and the amount of time, generations of people are spending time in refugee camps. Not one generation, multiple generations. And so forced displacement crises are growing, some driven by conflict, some driven by climate. And you literally have tens of millions of people who are desperate for safety. And globally, this is not just a problem that impacts the United States. It's a problem that is global. And Western countries, including the United States, are shutting their doors. That doesn't stop the problem. What we have to figure out is what works for our country now in this modern age where we need people, where populations are declining. The state of Connecticut is, I think, the 7th oldest state in the country in terms of the age of its population. And we need immigrants. And that's who we are. So, you know, I come at this maybe from a very different perspective. I'm looking at what's happening to the people we serve, the deep fear they feel, seeing these headlines, the rumors that are rampant, and we're trying to get real information to people about what they can do and the protections they can take in case they have an interaction with ICE. And I know there's Maureen Abel is on the show, and that's fantastic because New Haven Legal Aid is also a partner in trying to be proactive in helping folks if they have an encounter with ICE.
Oh, thank you so much, Maggie, for sharing your perspective and an important one as well, especially since you've been working with people on the ground. And you mentioned Maureen Abel, who's a staff attorney at New Haven Legal Assistance Association. You know, Maureen, curious as your thoughts. We'll get into your work, but since you've been listening to Maggie, you know, what are your thoughts about what she just shared?
Sure. So I agree with her. I agree with Sarah. The numbers and the backlogs are a problem, but I think the bigger problem is not just how narrow the pathways are, but what they are. So unless you are rich or famous, there is no pathway for self-directed immigration to this country anymore. There hasn't been for a little over a century. And what I mean by that is the way that you come here legally is an employer petitions for you, has a job waiting for you, or a family member has status and petitions for you. And the people who are related to US citizens or green card holders aren't necessarily a match for the slots in our economy that we need filled and the types of jobs where employers um, have connections with somebody overseas and know what their skill set is such that they're willing to hire them without a pre-existing relationship aren't necessarily those jobs, or certainly aren't exclusively those jobs where we have labor shortages. And so, beyond just shortening the backlogs and increasing the annual numbers, what we need is a way to get people in the types of jobs that need doing and that people without lawful status are currently doing. Those people would love a legal pathway to do the work they're already doing. There just isn't one.
And so before we get into your work, I do want to ask Sarah to respond as well to what Maggie shared with us earlier. And lots of echoing, I think, in terms of not seeing much change over the last, it sounds like 3 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge problem. We're facing this demographic cliff in the country. We need workers desperately, but we have, this problem where immigration is so overly politicized that we haven't been able to push through reform. And yeah, we're facing this problem that we all agree upon and can't seem to get to a solution. So I think the politics of immigration are extremely difficult, and then the Trump administration using immigration in the way that they do as their primary political strategy only makes it more complicated.
And so, Maureen, because you're also at the Yale Law School with the Immigration Rights Clinic, and I imagine this has been an incredibly challenging time for both your clients and yourselves as immigration attorneys, and the system has always been very complicated. Can you give us an idea of what has it been like for you to navigate that this year?
Sure. So I'll talk about a particular client who's given me permission to discuss his case. He's a clinic client, which means that he had students representing him. I supervised, but they were Yale Law School students, have been doing a fantastic job. He entered the country seeking asylum in 2024. And because of regulations implemented by the Biden administration, when he had his trial last year, the judge decided he wasn't eligible for asylum. Now, under the statute, the actual law, he absolutely was. But the regulations have, and I'm trying not to be too wonky here, but the regulations have narrowed eligibility in a way that I think most, if not all, practitioners think is illegal, and there are lawsuits challenging that. Didn't have a resolution in time for his trial, so the students are appealing that decision. But that was one way that recent changes have made this more difficult. He was redetained for supposedly not going to his check-ins with ICE, which frankly I think was either a systems error in the app that notifies him or possibly a communication barrier. He speaks a sort of rare dialect of a not very common language, and he's had a lot of language barriers and a lot of miscommunication issues in his case. including occasionally with us. And so he was redetained, and because of new interpretations of the rules around mandatory detention and when people can be released when they're arrested by ICE, we weren't able to get him out until very recently. We had to go into federal court, file a habeas petition. That was successful, and only then were we able to have a hearing. That was just Tuesday, and so the judge said he can be released if he pays an $8,000 bond, which we're now trying to fundraise. And so there's been a lot of moving parts, and it's been a lot more difficult. And we were worried about the new rules about third country removal, both third country removal for people who are still seeking asylum because of these cooperative agreements that the Trump administration has made with a lot of smaller countries, and also because the denial of asylum means he was given withholding. So similar to Kilmar Abrego Garcia, it's a definite finding that he was persecuted, that he is in danger at home, but it does leave him vulnerable to being sent somewhere else.
And so I'm curious if, Sarah, you have thoughts on this too, but Maureen, because you mentioned this client who is seeking asylum and what a process that both of you and your students have gone through together. And it seems like the immigration system and the asylum system are two very different systems. So when it comes to these, what are some immediate, I know this is a big question, but what are some immediate changes that you would like to see, especially in your case, Maureen, talking about the asylum system?
Yeah, so the asylum system is kind of like, if you think of if you compare the immigration system to a hospital, asylum is the emergency room. Asylum is you had a car crash, you just got shot, you cannot wait in line, you have an emergency need that needs to be dealt with now. And so for that reason, the statute says that asylum is an option for anyone who has managed to physically get here. We don't make you wait and pre-apply, and we don't really care how you come in. You're in a crisis, just get here. And the regulation I mentioned is an attempt to limit that, to say, no, you have to go through these procedural hurdles. You have to wait at the border and use this app that isn't offered is offered in very, very few languages and was not offered in the language my client speaks. And if you don't follow these procedures because you didn't necessarily even know they existed, because again, of the language you speak, we're nevertheless going to impose these penalties on you. So I would like to see that gotten rid of. They've recently jacked up the fee for asylum. It didn't used to have a fee. It's now $100 to apply and $100 every year to keep your application open as it goes through the backlogs, which is crazy. Especially since one of the new changes that President Trump just announced is he would like to basically get rid of work authorization for people while they wait in this backlog. So not sure where they're going to come up with the money for the new fees. And while all of this is happening, and while the Attorney General, who is the head of the court system that oversees asylum and can write her own precedential laws, has been writing all sorts of changes to how this is interpreted, none of which is favorable to immigrants. They also just decided that starting next month, the appeals court for immigration is basically going to cease to be functional. So all of these appeals are going to have to go to circuit court if you can afford to find a lawyer to handle it.
And so, Sarah,
I love to jump
in. A lot that's happened in a very short time to make this non-functional. And I'm sorry to unload all of that on you.
No, and I mean, those are really great points to make. And it just goes to show and helps us understand better that it's already a system that's extremely complicated. And then let alone all of the things that you just added on top to it makes it a lot more fluid than it is. So, Sarah, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I really want to praise Maureen's comparison to a hospital. It's beautiful because that also helps explain the dynamic between the broken immigration system and how its effect on the asylum system, right? So let's So the immigration system is broken, as Maureen so well laid out earlier. It's nearly impossible to immigrate to the United States, even though we have this huge demand for workers in the United States. So instead, the asylum system, or the emergency room in this hypothetical, becomes the default. So because people can't make, let's say, appointments at the hospital, they're instead coming in through the emergency room, even if they don't actually have an emergency. And that hurts the system, the integrity of the system, and it also hurts the people who legitimately have emergencies that are coming to the border because they are fleeing persecution. So it's a really great analogy to help explain, what all these problems are. And one thing you can do is you can actually look at the arrivals at the southern border and see how they fluctuate with the job market demand in the United States. When we have a huge job market demand, we have a huge increase of arrivals at the southern border. And that's not everything that leads to people arriving to the southern border. Many of them are fleeing horrific things that happen in their home country, and they would come either way, no matter whether or not there's job demand. But it's also being used to feed the US economy because our immigration system is so broken. So it's hugely damaging for the asylum system that we have such a broken and outdated immigration system.
We'll be continuing our conversation about immigration reform after a quick break. With us today is Sarah Pierce, who's the Director of Social Policy at Third Way, which is a national think tank and advocacy organization, and also Maureen Abel, who's a staff attorney at New Haven Legal Assistance Association and also with the Yale Law School. They'll be staying with us. This is Where We Live, and we will be back after a quick break. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today we ask the question, what does meaningful immigration reform look like? And what does ICE presence mean for immigrants living in Connecticut? Still with us is Maureen Abel, who's a staff attorney at New Haven Legal Assistance Association, and also Sarah Pierce, who's Director of Social Policy at Third Way. So, Maureen, we talked about earlier that there has been arrests made here in Connecticut, and a lot of those immigrant arrests take place at courthouses when they're there for their hearings. Curious to hear, what have you been seeing here in Connecticut?
So I personally have been extremely lucky, and I haven't had any clients, pre-existing clients, detained so far, although my colleagues, including my colleagues at the office, have. Courthouses, especially state courthouses, have been a really big focal site. And we've also seen some sort of stereotypical work sites, like car washes, that seem to be common targets. So we've seen some pushback from this at the state level in terms of the legality of arrests inside a state courthouse. I would love to see more judges really consider how often hearings are necessary and how often hearings have to be in person, considering that if this is a state level legal proceeding, these judges have a very real interest in making sure that these cases are resolved on the actual merits of the case and not just because a party or a witness is removed from the state.
And once arrests happen, how challenging is it for detainees to contact their families and attorneys? Because it sounds like making any contact in and out of these detention facilities is extremely challenging.
It is. And it depends on where they go. People can be sent anywhere. They are sent everywhere. They're often moved within the system. So, for example, my client, Ahmed, that I talked about before, I didn't say his name before, I have his permission. We were lucky. One of the reasons we picked him up as a client was he was in Providence, which is pretty close. But then a week before his trial, he got moved for reasons I've never fully understood to New Hampshire, which is much further because it's at a facility up on the Canadian border. That's where he still is. The New England facilities aren't that bad for us, both because of distance and because they tend to they're all either federal Department of, corrections, actual prisons, or they are state level county jails that contract with ICE. And so they have very professional standards. They're not everything we could hope for. There's a lawsuit against one of the counties in Massachusetts that has opened up better access, but it's much better than if you end up at these private prison facilities that are mostly in the southern states. And that's where I see much more difficulty contacting people.
Well, and you mentioned this idea of whether or not these hearings need to happen in person or the amount of hearings that needs to happen in person. So other than potentially doing these hearings remotely, do you see if there are any other protections that can be given? And is there much that state officials can help out with that?
So state officials have tried to beef up the rules, sort of substitute a state level sensitive locations requirements. The question is, of course, whether or not ICE will respect that, whether or not ICE will go to just outside of the perimeter because it's still a known date. I would just point out, as far as do hearings have to happen in person, we got along with an almost entirely remote system in 2020 and in 2021 when it was a matter of the physical security, the physical safety of the people involved in terms of a virus. I think we should look into that because now it really is the integrity of our legal system. Criminal cases cannot proceed if we are missing not just defendants, but if we're potentially missing victims or witnesses. Other proceedings can't proceed without the people that need to participate to make them happen.
And so, Sarah, we've been talking a lot about potential immigration reform and the need for it. And so when it comes to broader immigration reform, are we talking mainly about creating better pathways to citizenship?
Yeah, definitely. We need to improve the pathways to immigrate and the pathways to get citizenship in the United States and make sure that we have a system that's responsive to the needs of the country. Right now, those numbers were stupidly is the only word I can think of right now, stupidly set into statute in the 1980s and are just not sufficient. And most modern economies have an immigration system that changes, that flexes with the needs of the country where the numbers adjust. That's desperately what we need in the United States. But we also desperately need legalization for most of the 13 million people who live in the United States in unauthorized status. They're contributing to our economy, our communities, our culture, and it's only hurting ourselves that they don't actually have authorized status here.
Well, and we've been talking a lot about this idea of reform, and the conversation, of course, has been happening for a very long time now. How far away are we from this type of reform? Are you hearing conversations about legalization?
I'm always hearing conversations about legalization. I think those of us who work in immigration are optimists to our own detriment. Obviously, there's this conversation on the Hill right now about reforms to DHS, but that's part of an appropriations fight. The results of that are going to be very limited, and at best, they will have reforms to how immigration enforcement operates within the country. I think there is a window, a possibility that immigration reform could happen under the Trump presidency. First, it needs to start with Donald Trump himself, right? President Trump needs to think that he could be the one to finally fix this unfixable problem. And if he decides that he's going to be the one to take it on, then Republicans will be on board and we can actually have conversations about what immigration reform could look like. But that's a big ask, right? Because his right-hand man is Stephen Miller, who would never want immigration reform to move forward in any sort of realistic space. So yes, there is maybe a sliver of possibility that this could happen under Trump's presidency, but I'm not super optimistic about it, especially as long as Stephen Miller is in the White House.
And what are you hearing from your clients? Are you hearing more concern, more optimism? What's that been like?
Maureen?
Oh, is that? I was trying to, I didn't.
That could go for Maureen as well.
Clients.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I don't have clients, so. I figured it was for Maureen.
Yeah, I think that my clients are much more aware of the enforcement changes and much more of the rumors that are going around are about fears of new dangers in ICE enforcement. I have not had a optimistic rumor go around in quite a while.
Well, and it sounds like for you too, there's a big demand for services right now. Is it more than you're able to meet?
I mean, it was even before. It's something like 17% of residents of Connecticut who are in removal proceedings who even have an attorney. And that's the people who are in removal proceedings. There are plenty of people who are potentially eligible to have more immigration stability or upgrade their status, who themselves are fighting to find an attorney. There's just not nearly enough capacity in the country as a whole, but certainly not in Connecticut.
And are you hearing the same from your colleagues and peers as well, where it seems like that's been the constant feeling is being overcapacitated, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And people are trying to do what they can to expand capacity. We're trying to do more, maybe limited representation where we don't take on a whole case, but we'll at least help people get their initial paperwork. And then hopefully they'll be able to find an attorney at some point later on, or at least we've protected their right to have a trial. Attorneys who are in other practice areas are looking to get trained in parts of immigration processes so they can at least take the pressure off people who are trained to do the more complicated stuff. It's been gratifying how much people are volunteering, but we still need a lot more capacity than we have.
Well, and Sarah, as a descendant of working class immigrants, is reforming our immigration system personal for you?
Yeah, absolutely. My my grandparents would not have been able to come here under the current system. So I would love to see that reform. I mean, that's what I've been working for my entire career. I imagine Maureen feels similarly, and to see it finally happen would be amazing. And that's probably that optimistic drive that I will continue pursuing to my own detriment.
Well, Maureen, you're smiling. I do want to extend the same question to you too, in terms of how personal is this work for you?
I mean, I stumbled into it as the work that was available to me as a baby attorney, grew to love it. And yeah, like Sarah, my family came when the rules were basically show up, be white, don't be obviously insane or consumptive. And if we had to go through this current system, I would not be here either.
Well, and we've covered so much ground in this conversation today. I would love some final thoughts from both of you. And Sarah, I think I'll just start with you here. What do you hope our listeners take away today?
Sure. I mean, I think what we've laid out in this conversation is how there are realistic changes that we could make to our immigration system that everyone can agree upon, right? Changes that we can make to the system that just improve the quality of life in this country overall. And instead, we've been stuck with this idea at our political level that there are two extremes, right? Like wide open borders and no rules versus masked armed men roving through the streets and arresting everyone indiscriminately. And I think the vast majority of Americans are hanging out in the middle. And I think we need to encourage our political leaders to join us in the middle.
Well, thank you so much for that. I want to thank Sarah Pierce, who's the Director of Social Policy at Third Way. Sarah, appreciate your time and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
You are also listening to Maureen Abel, who's a staff attorney at New Haven Legal Assistance Association and also a visiting clinical professor at Yale Law School. Maureen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Eugene Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.